All right, so you're here because you want to dive deep and get to the real heart of a story.
A really, really complex one.
Oh, yeah, this one's a tough one. And you want to understand it quickly, right? You don't want to have to wade through tons and tons of details.
You want the good stuff.
Exactly. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to take a deep dive into Gregg Olsen's If You Tell, a true story of murder, family secrets, and the unbreakable bond of sisterhood.
A fantastic book.
Yeah, and we're going to be using all the material that you sent over.
Right, and I think it's so crucial to understand from the very beginning that this book goes into the really horrific abuse inflicted by Shelly Knotek
Oh, yeah?
on her family and others who were living in her household in the Pacific Northwest.
Right, and it's not just recounting these events. It's trying to understand that initial portrait that Olsen is painting.
Exactly.
Okay, so to do that, we have some excerpts that you flagged. Some initial praise that the book received, which kind of gives us a perspective on the impact of this book.
Right.
A list of Olsen's other works to give us a sense of his approach. Sure.
There's really telling chapter titles that hint at the darkness to come,
Mm-hmm.
and then some critical early passages that really kind of set up the whole foundation of the story.
Really lay that groundwork.
Yeah. So what are we aiming for in this deep dive?
Well, I think what we're really aiming for is to understand the very beginnings, the nascent stages of Shelly Knotek's character as it's presented in these early sections. And it's kind of dissect how Olsen builds this atmosphere of pervasive fear and instability that really becomes a hallmark of her interactions with everyone.
Okay, so the book starts by really grounding us in Battleground, Washington. It's this small town. It's described as having a history of bloody earth and betrayal. Even the name kind of recalls this violent standoff.
Right.
So when you first read that and you're thinking about the story that unfolds, does that setting feel significant to you at all?
I mean, what's fascinating there is how Olsen really sets up this backdrop that isn't one of simple tranquility. You know?
There's this history of conflict in the town. Even the name itself subtly hints at these underlying tensions, and perhaps even like a predisposition towards darker events. It's a detail that he places right there at the very beginning.
Yeah.
And it really suggests it's part of this environment in which these events unfold.
Yeah, okay. Then we're introduced to Les Watson, Shelly's stepfather. His first wife, Sharon Todd Watson, Shelly's biological mother, is depicted as struggling with some pretty serious issues, depression and alcoholism.
Right.
And this leads to a pretty significant shift for Shelly and her siblings early on.
It does. So she reaches out to Les from California, asking him to take in Shelly, Chuck, and Paul.
Yeah.
And the book really notes that Les hadn't even discussed this with his wife, Laura.
Wow.
Describing it as typical of Les.
Oh, wow.
So her inability to care for her children really sets this new family dynamic in motion.
And then the tragedy deepens even more with the revelation that Sharon is later beaten to death while she was homeless in Skid Row. And incredibly, the family doesn't even claim her remains or hold any kind of memorial.
No.
The book mentions this scarcity of photos of her, and in the ones that exist, she's almost always unsmiling.
Right.
Her perpetual despondency preserved forever. Just paints a really bleak picture of Shelly's early maternal experience.
Absolutely. A lack of a stable, nurturing maternal presence,
Yeah.
in those really formative years could certainly be a contributing factor to later complexities.
Right.
But, and it's so vital to remember this as we delve deeper.
Yeah.
This doesn't excuse the horrific choices that she makes.
Of course not.
The narrative then introduces Laura and her initial observations of the children.
Right. And Laura very quickly starts noticing some deeply disturbing behaviors.
Yeah.
Especially from young Shelly, putting pieces of glass in her siblings' shoes. When you come across a detail like that so early on, what insight does it give you into Shelly's character?
It's not just typical childhood mischief, right?
No.
This is a really stark indicator, I think, of a fundamental lack of empathy and a real predisposition toward inflicting harm on others.
Right.
And it's so interesting, Laura's own question, what kind of person does something like that?
Yeah.
Really mirrors what we as readers are feeling.
Oh, boy.
It sets this precedent for her future behavior, and it immediately flags her as someone who's deeply troubled.
Okay. The book then introduces Shelly's paternal grandmother, Anna Watson. And it seems like this familial connection might shed more light on the origins of some of these behaviors.
It might. And what's so fascinating here is the description of Anna's own abusive actions.
Right?
You know, the incident where she's repeatedly flushing young Pearlie's head in the toilet bowl?
Oh my God.
It's genuinely shocking.
It's awful.
And Laura's reaction is stunned. And having never heard of such a thing,
Right.
it really highlights the extreme nature of this behavior.
Yeah.
And it sort of establishes this multi-generational pattern of abusive behavior
Right.
within the family, suggesting that Shelly may have learned these tactics
Oh,
early on and tragically normalized them.
Yeah. And Laura clearly lived in constant fear of Anna.
Yeah.
The book says that seeing her mother-in-law meant this involuntary tightening of the muscles
Right.
along her spine.
Oh, God.
And relief only came when Anna passed by without interacting with her.
Wow.
This pervasive sense of fear within the family seems to be this recurring undercurrent, even before Shelley's own behavior really takes hold.
I think that's right. Laura's constant anxiety around her really demonstrates these power dynamics at play and the potential for intimidation within the family, even before Shelley's more overt abuse.
Right.
It creates this baseline of fear within the household, this sense that boundaries are easily crossed, and that authority figures can be sources of distress rather than safety and security.
Yeah, okay. So moving into Shelley's teenage years, the situation really starts to escalate. And we have the incredibly serious false accusation of rape against her stepfather.
Right.
This feels like a real turning point in understanding the extent of her manipulative capabilities.
I think it is a stark revelation. It demonstrates this capacity for significant manipulation and a willingness to inflict serious harm through calculated lies.
Yeah.
Even Laura, who had already witnessed Shelley's tendency to be untruthful, found this accusation too much.
Yeah.
It's a calculated cruelty.
Yeah.
And this chilling disregard for the devastating consequences of such a false claim.
So Laura's search of Shelley's room after this accusation provides another layer to her character.
Right.
The room is described as so messy and chaotic, but amidst this disarray, she finds notebooks filled with these poetic scribblings.
Yeah.
What do you make of this stark contrast?
I think it presents a really complex and perhaps unsettling picture of her.
Yeah.
The outward chaos could reflect this inner turmoil, a lack of order in her internal world.
Yeah.
But the poetry suggests this possible rich internal life, a need for self-expression, however dark or distorted it might be.
Right.
It hints that there's more beneath the surface than just simple teenage rebellion or defiance. But it also makes you wonder, could this poetry also be a form of manipulation?
Yeah.
You know, creating this facade of sensitivity or depth.
That's a good point.
It's a question worth considering as we move forward.
Definitely.
Yeah.
The Watsons then attempt to find alternative schooling for Shelley, eventually sending her to live with Laura's parents in Hoodsport.
Right.
This attempt to provide a more stable environment, though, doesn't seem to have the intended effect.
Well, quite the opposite, actually.
Yeah.
Shelley's behavior persists and may even intensify.
Wow.
Throwing away dishes, barricading children while she was babysitting. These actions demonstrate a continued disregard for others.
Yeah.
And this escalating pattern of really disruptive behavior, even Laura's parents, who opened their home to her, quickly learned to walk on eggshells around her.
Oh, wow.
Highlighting her consistent ability to create this chaos and fear wherever she went.
And she turned on her own grandparents after just a few weeks.
She did.
It really paints a picture of someone resistant to any form of help or stability.
Yeah.
She eventually returns home, and her negative influence on her siblings is described as turning them into this disruptive mob with her as the leader.
Right.
This just sounds like a complete breakdown of any kind of healthy sibling dynamics.
It really illustrates her power within the family and her ability to manipulate and control even those younger than her.
Right.
Laura's description of them becoming this mob under Shelley's influence really underscores the extent to which she could just disrupt and dominate that household.
Yeah.
It signifies this complete erosion of normal familial bonds and healthy sibling relationships.
Yeah. Then we see Shelley's early romantic relationships, starting with Randy Brevard in Pennsylvania during her teenage years.
Right.
This sounds like a pretty typical teenage romance, at least initially.
Yeah, the initial portrayal is this young couple who seemed very well suited.
Yeah.
Shelley was considered very attractive, and they were described as a striking couple.
Okay.
However, this seemingly normal beginning quickly unravels upon her return to Washington, really revealing those established patterns even in romantic connections.
Okay, so their rushed marriage, after Shelley comes back to Washington, is marked by some really strange details,
It is.
like Randy's family and friends being completely absent from the wedding
Right.
because Shelly never sent out the invitations.
Right.
That's a huge red flag, signaling her desire for control.
It is, absolutely. This deliberate isolation of him from his support network
Right.
is a classic abuser tactic,
Yeah.
immediately establishing her controlling nature in the relationship.
Yeah.
And the fact that Les even stepped in to pick Randy's best man
Oh.
underscores how eager the family seemed to be to facilitate this marriage,
Right.
perhaps as a way to manage her behavior.
So the book then details Shelley's unemployment, her complete lack of domestic responsibility, and her demanding nature, drawing this direct parallel to her grandma Anna.
Right.
This really reinforces the idea of learned behavior or a disturbing continuation of this family pattern.
I think the comparison to Anna is so significant here.
Yeah.
It strongly suggests that she may have internalized and adopted these manipulative
Right.
and entitled behaviors
Yeah.
from her upbringing. Her expectation of being cared for without contributing to the household
Yeah,
really mirrors Anna's described behavior,
it does.
highlighting a potential cycle of unhealthy relational patterns being passed down.
And despite that earlier, really devastating false accusation of rape, Shelley continues to manipulate her father Les for money and material possessions.
Right.
It seems like the fear within the family remained really potent,
It did.
making it easier to give in to her demands rather than confront her.
Absolutely. The Watsons' continued fear of her is palpable in these interactions.
Yeah.
The book's observation that it was easier to give her everything she wanted just to keep her happy and at bay speaks volumes about that dysfunctional family dynamic.
Yeah.
Appeasement had become their primary, albeit ineffective strategy for dealing with her volatile behavior.
Then we have yet another false accusation of rape. This time, seemingly used as a tool to get out of living in a trailer because it wasn't good enough
Right.
for Les Watson's daughter.
Right.
This solidifies this really disturbing pattern of using incredibly serious accusations for personal gain.
Absolutely. It really reinforces that pattern of manipulation
Yeah.
and the willingness to employ these extreme measures like fabricating rape
Right.
to achieve her desired outcome.
Yeah.
It demonstrates this profound lack of empathy and this really disturbing sense of entitlement.
Right.
Her desire for this more comfortable living situation at any cost really underscores this deeply manipulative aspect of her personality.
We also see Shelley accumulating unpaid bills and bounce checks throughout the town, with Randy constantly left to shoulder the financial burden.
Right.
This paints a picture of extreme financial irresponsibility and a complete lack of consideration for her husband's well-being.
It really showcases that sense of entitlement and this blatant disregard for the financial stability of their household. You know, the initial resistance from business owners, followed by their eventual capitulation, likely speaks to a combination of her manipulative tactics
Right.
and perhaps the Watson family's influence within that small community.
Right.
Randy's constant need to cover her debts really highlights his increasing entrapment in this chaotic web.
The birth of their daughter, Nikki, doesn't seem to alter Shelley's established patterns at all.
It doesn't.
In fact, Laura immediately feels this deep and protective affection for Nikki, while Shelley appears largely disinterested in her infant daughter.
Right.
This is a pretty striking contrast in maternal instincts, or really lack thereof.
It is a remarkably stark contrast.
Yeah.
Laura's immediate and profound bond with Nikki and her really deep concern for the baby's well-being really highlights Shelley's apparent lack of maternal instinct, or at least a significant emotional detachment from her own child.
Right.
And this forces Laura into this primary caregiver role very early in Nikki's life.
And Randy and Shelley's marriage deteriorates rapidly, fueled by her continued financial irresponsibility and emotional manipulation.
Yeah.
The fact that she was only pleasant to him in public,
Right.
while he resorted to sleeping in his car, really speaks volumes about the toxic state of their relationship.
Yeah, that public versus private behavior
Yeah.
perfectly illustrates the breakdown of that marriage.
Yeah.
You know, Randy's experience of her carefully constructed public persona
Yeah.
versus her cruel private behavior is a common tactic
Yeah.
used by manipulative individuals to maintain appearances and to control their partners.
Right.
His having to seek refuge in his car really underscores the level of emotional and likely verbal abuse that he was enduring in that home.
And then Les Watson's interference by directing Randy's paycheck straight to Shelley further disempowers Randy.
Right.
And inadvertently enables her destructive behavior.
It does.
It seems like Les's attempts to control the situation really only exacerbate the problem.
I think Les's action, while perhaps intended to ensure his granddaughter was provided for, ultimately reinforces her financial control
Right.
and isolates Randy and contributes to the overall instability of that family unit.
Yeah.
It's another clear example of how the family's attempts to manage her behavior inadvertently perpetuated it.
Then, in a shocking move, Shelly abandons Nikki with Laura for almost a year.
Right.
Only to suddenly return and reclaim her daughter.
Yeah.
This erratic and unpredictable behavior must have been incredibly traumatizing.
It must have been. It demonstrates a profound inconsistency and a deep lack of genuine maternal commitment.
Yeah.
Her impulsive decision to leave and then suddenly return without any real explanation or consideration for the emotional impact on Nikki or Laura really highlights her tendency to treat her daughter like an object, to be discarded and retrieved at her whim.
That's awful.
Laura's deep desire to keep Nikki and even pursue legal avenues to declare her abandoned really speaks to the strong emotional bond that they had formed.
Right. And the book also mentions Shelly writing these insincere expressions of devotion to Nikki.
Right.
That contrasts starkly with her actions.
They do.
This kind of underscores the performative nature of her interactions, at least in written form.
It does.
Suggesting a calculated attempt to appear caring when her behavior really indicated otherwise.
When placed against the backdrop of her actual abandonment and neglect, it reveals this deceptive facade, suggesting she understood the expected role of a mother and maybe even sought to portray that image, but was fundamentally unable or unwilling to embody it authentically in her actions.
Okay, so the narrative then shifts geographically to Raymond, Washington, and introduces us to the Knotek family. Al, Shirley, and their son Dave, who would become Shelly's next husband.
Right.
Dave is initially presented as this hard-working logger.
He is.
Seemingly a stable figure.
So his background as a logger from this working-class family in Raymond establishes this different social and economic context. Compared to Shelly's upbringing, he's portrayed as someone who valued hard work and a more traditional lifestyle. Which on the surface seems so different from Shelly. This contrast makes their eventual relationship and the events that follow even more unsettling.
Yeah, and the purchase of the house on Monaghan Landing Road becomes this really pivotal and almost ominous location in the story.
It does.
This house almost takes on a character of its own.
It really does.
As the setting for the horrific events to come.
The move to Monaghan Landing really marks a significant turning point in the book. This house becomes this isolated stage upon which the most extreme and prolonged acts of abuse detailed in the book will occur. It's where her control truly solidifies, far from any potential outside interference.
Early on in this new family dynamic, Shelly's abusive behavior towards her daughters, Nikki and Sami, escalates pretty dramatically.
It does.
We see beatings with various household objects becoming a regular occurrence. This is a horrifying intensification of her cruelty.
It is. The shift from primarily manipulative and emotional abuse toward her partners to this direct and frequent physical violence against her own children is a deeply disturbing escalation. The casual mention of using everyday objects as weapons really underscores the pervasive nature of the abuse within that household. Nowhere within those walls was a child safe from her violence.
And we get some really specific, chilling examples.
You do.
Pushing Nikki into a closet as punishment.
Yeah.
Locking her in her room right before Christmas.
Right.
And then showering her with gifts.
And then cruelly taking them back.
Only to cruelly take them all back.
Yeah.
These acts seem so deliberately designed to inflict both physical pain and profound psychological trauma.
They're textbook examples of cyclical abuse. And calculated cruelty. The initial act of violence, followed by this fleeting offer of kindness, the Christmas gift, really serves to confuse the victim and reinforce the abuser's power. It creates this cycle of hope and crushing disappointment, making it even harder for the child to understand the reality of their situation and to resist.
The imposition of these restrictive bathroom rules is another really disturbing element of control. Stripping away basic human dignity.
It is about asserting that absolute power and dominance over her children's most fundamental needs.
Then there's the introduction of wallowing as this particularly dehumanizing form of punishment.
Right.
The description of Nikki being forced into an icy mud puddle in the dead of winter is just brutal.
It is.
And then Sami's unsettling desire for similar punishment.
Yeah.
What does that tell you about the atmosphere that Shelly created?
I think wallowing is a particularly cruel and dehumanizing act of torture.
Yeah.
Sami's desire to be subjected to the same abuse while disturbing really highlights this profoundly distorted reality within that household.
Right.
It suggests she may have internalized this idea that punishment, even extreme punishment, was a form of attention.
Right.
A way to feel connected to her sister and perversely to her abusive mother.
Yeah.
It speaks to this complete erosion of normal boundaries and this desperate search for connection in a terrifying environment.
We also see further examples of physical abuse.
We do.
Nikki being lashed with a whip for resisting punishment.
Yeah.
The level of violence is really shocking and demonstrates this deliberate intent to inflict severe pain.
The use of a whip really signifies this calculated and intentional infliction of pain and suffering.
Right.
Nikki's resistance to such brutal treatment only results in further violence, reinforcing the futility of defiance and the absolute power that she wielded over her children.
Sami's coping mechanism of aligning herself with her mother, even participating in the abuse of Nikki, is sad.
Yeah.
But tragically understandable as a survival tactic.
Absolutely.
In such a terrifying and unpredictable environment.
Aligning with the abuser is a common and heartbreaking trauma response. By trying to please Shelly and participating in the abuse of her sister, Sami likely hoped to avoid becoming the primary target of her mother's cruelty, though it did create a damaging and complex dynamic between the sisters.
Despite these horrific circumstances, Nikki finds refuge in books while she's confined to her room.
Right.
And the sisters develop these small, secret ways to maintain contact, like tossing pine cones.
Yeah.
These small acts of defiance and connection really highlight their resilience.
They do.
And the enduring power of their bond.
Despite the unimaginable circumstances, those efforts to maintain a connection highlight their remarkable resilience and their determination to find solace and support in each other. Nikki's escape into books offers this temporary reprieve from this brutal reality, and it underscores the importance of these small acts of solidarity.
Then the severe incident where Shelly pushed Nikki through a glass door really illustrates this sudden, unpredictable, and extreme violence that could erupt at any moment.
It does. This violent act underscores that volatile and terrifying nature of Shelly's rage. The suddenness and severity of that attack, leaving her injured and bleeding, really emphasizes the constant danger and unpredictability that those children lived under, never knowing when her temper would explode.
So the arrival of Shane Watson, Shelly's nephew, it initially brings this kind of brief glimmer of hope to the family dynamic. He's described as sweet. And having this really optimistic outlook. Which is such a stark contrast.
It is.
To the prevailing darkness in that house.
Shane's introduction as someone bringing hope and an optimistic attitude really does create this fleeting moment of light within an increasingly dark narrative. His initial positive interactions with Nikki and Sami suggest this possibility of a more normal family dynamic. A hope that is quickly extinguished, unfortunately.
Shelly applying for benefits to care for Shane and setting up a room for him. Initially, it seems like a genuinely caring act. And he even begins to refer to Shelly and Dave as mom and dad. Suggesting this kind of growing sense of belonging.
It creates this deceptive illusion of care. And a semblance of this stable and supportive family environment for him, especially given his own really difficult background. However, as the narrative unfolds, this initial appearance of kindness is tragically short-lived.
But then Shane's own difficult background is revealed during a family trip. And shortly after that, Shelly's behavior towards him undergoes this disturbing transformation, mirroring the horrific abuse that Nikki endured. Beatings, wallowing, even these bizarre and humiliating punishments like nude slow dancing. It's this chillingly repetitive pattern of cruelty.
The repetition of these patterns really highlights that her cruelty wasn't specific to her own daughters, but was a more generalized aspect of her personality, driven by a deep need for control and a disturbing capacity for inflicting pain. The added element of public humiliation really underscores the psychological torment she inflicted.
Laura's continued inability to understand the origins of Shelly's behavior is mentioned again around this time.
Yeah.
It seems those within her orbit consistently struggled to comprehend the root causes of her cruelty.
Lara's ongoing bewilderment really underscores the seemingly inexplicable nature of Shelley's cruelty.
Right.
Her inability to find a logical explanation rooted in her childhood
Yeah.
highlights the depth of her pathology and the profound disconnect between her actions and any understandable motivation.
So Nikki and Shane's shared experience of abuse forges this strong bond between them,
It does.
even leading to these shared revenge fantasies against Shelly. This really speaks to the intensity of the suffering they endured together.
Yeah.
And their longing for escape.
Their shared trauma creates this powerful and essential connection.
Yeah.
A real sense of solidarity in their suffering.
Right.
And these revenge fantasies, while perhaps never acted upon at this stage, reveal the depth of their anger, their resentment, and their desperate yearning to escape their horrific reality.
So the introduction of Kathy Loreno initially seems like Shelly is stepping into a role of rescuer.
Yeah.
Kathy's portrayed as someone who's lonely and estranged from her own family,
Right.
making her particularly vulnerable.
Kathy's arrival under the guise of being rescued sets this deliberately deceptive tone.
Right.
Shelly so often presented herself as a caregiver or a helper,
Yeah.
masking her true manipulative intentions.
Right.
Kathy's isolation and financial struggles made her a really easy target for her predatory behavior.
And Kathy's background reveals a history of financial dependence on her mother and a recent move back home after losing her job, further highlighting her vulnerability and her potential need for support and stability.
Her financial difficulties and reliance on her mother underscore her precarious situation and make her particularly susceptible to Shelley's false promises of support and belonging. She was clearly seeking stability and connection, which Shelly exploited.
Kathy's move into Shelly and Dave's home marks the beginning of her systematic isolation from her own family.
It does.
And this seems to be a key recurring tactic that Shelly employs to gain complete control over the individuals she targets.
Isolating victims from their existing support networks, family friends, is a classic and highly effective abuser tactic. By deliberately separating Kathy from her family, Shelly really increased Kathy's dependence on her and made it significantly more difficult for her to seek help or to escape that increasingly dangerous situation.
Early signs of Shelly's manipulation of Kathy include forcing her to lie and administering pills. This establishes a clear pattern of control and raises serious concerns about Kathy's well-being.
Absolutely. These early manipulations demonstrate her methods of exerting control over Kathy, forcing compliance through lies, and potentially using medication to subdue or confuse her. It's a clear indication that she is being brought into that web of control.
And Shane and Nikki are both aware of Shelly's abusive behavior towards Kathy, indicating that the cruelty is becoming more overt, even if they themselves feel powerless to intervene or to understand the extent of what's happening.
Their awareness, despite their own victimhood, suggests that her behavior was becoming increasingly blatant within the home. However, as children and victims themselves, they likely feared the repercussions of speaking out or intervening, highlighting the climate of fear that she had cultivated.
An instance of Shelly physically pushing Kathy down the stairs marks a significant escalation of the abuse.
It does.
Moving beyond manipulation and control. To direct physical violence. And placing Kathy in immediate physical danger.
This act of violence really signifies a dangerous escalation in her abuse of Kathy. It moves beyond emotional manipulation and establishes this very real physical threat that she now faces within that house, foreshadowing even more severe harm to come.
Then the really disturbing shift where Shelly enlists her own children, Nikki and Sami, and even Shane in Kathy's punishments, is particularly horrific.
It is.
The book notes Shane's conflicted motivations for participating, likely driven by fear and a desperate attempt to survive within this environment.
Enlisting others in the abuse really creates a climate of pervasive fear and forced complicity. Shane's participation likely fueled by his own terror of her, and perhaps a misguided attempt to gain her approval or to avoid becoming the next target, reveals the deeply complex and psychologically damaging dynamics at play within this abused household.
And Kathy's palpable fear of Shane, despite his own status as a victim, underscores these profoundly distorted power dynamics
Absolutely.
that Shelly has so effectively created and maintained.
Kathy's fear of Shane, one of her fellow victims, tragically illustrates how she successfully manipulated the situation, fostering distrust and fear amongst those she abused, thereby solidifying